My name is Taylor, and for 8 years, I was the invisible structural integrity of Morgan and Company. I was the lead design engineer, the one who turned my father's messy manual sketches into ironclad blueprints that passed every city audit in Chicago. I thought I was building a legacy, but I was actually just building a stage for someone else to stand on. The realization hit me on a Tuesday morning, right in the middle of a high-stakes site visit for our newest luxury development. My phone buzzed with a firm-wide notification. It was a formal PDF titled Leadership Restructuring. I opened it, expecting to see my promotion to partner finalized at last. Instead, the words rearranged my entire world. Effective immediately, my younger brother Jordan was appointed as managing partner. My father, Mark, and my mother, Michelle, had signed off on it without a single word to me. As I scrolled through the new hierarchy list, looking for my place in the empire I'd helped create, I felt a freezing, clinical clarity settle in. My name wasn't there. I had been demoted to a creative consultant with no voting rights and no authority. I wasn't just sidelined. I was erased. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I stayed silent. I didn't let a single sound escape as I stood on the job site. Instead, I felt a calm, numbing precision wash over me. It was the kind of clarity you get when you realize the structural load of a building has been miscalculated, the disaster has already happened, and now it's just about the cleanup. I returned to my car, navigated the mid-morning Chicago traffic, and entered the office building that still bore our family name. I could see Jordan through the glass of my office. He was already in there, holding a tape measure against the window frame and discussing open concept energy with a frightened-looking intern. He looked up as I entered, flashing that easy, golden child smile that had carried him through 2 failed tech startups and a 14-month soul-searching trip to Thailand. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He looked like he was finally claiming his birthright. "Hey, Taylor," he said, not even putting the tape measure down. "Dad said you might need a break. We're gonna turn this space into a creative hub. Fresh perspective, you know?" I offered no rebuttal. I didn't even acknowledge his presence. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and began the process of clinical retaliation. For 8 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and I had just realized that the subscription was canceled. I wasn't just a daughter, I was the proprietary owner of the firm's most critical intellectual property. For 8 years, I had lived in a cage without bars. I had stayed quiet, worked 80-hour weeks, and fixed every one of Jordan's professional disasters because I thought loyalty was a currency that would eventually be returned. I was a survivor of a dynamic that turned my competence into a utility for the family's comfort. But as I watched Jordan mark up my walls with a pencil, I realized that the bars of that cage were only made of my own willingness to hold the ceiling up. If I walked away, the roof would come down, and for the first time, I was ready to let it fall. With methodical speed, I navigated to our shared server. I didn't touch the company's official documents, those belonged to the firm, but my proprietary structural safety algorithms, the ones I had written at midnight to pass the city's newest seismic codes, belonged to me. The legacy project blueprints, the $8,640,000 development that only existed because the client trusted my signature, were stored in my personal encrypted vault. I removed my frameworks from the server. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, erasing years of shortcuts, vendor contacts, and institutional knowledge that lived only in my head and my files. By the time Jordan asked if I was okay with a sage green accent wall, the firm's operational brain was gone. I stood up, grabbed my leather portfolio, and walked to the receptionist's desk. I placed my keycard on the counter with a soft click. I looked out at the Chicago skyline, the sun glinting off the steel and glass I had helped design. It was the longest breath I had taken in nearly a decade. I was no longer an invisible pillar, I was a void, and they were about to find out exactly how much weight I had been carrying. I sat in my apartment, the silence so thick I could almost hear the firm's foundations cracking from 3 miles away. I looked at my hands, no longer covered in the grit of a job site, and remembered the cost of my silence. For 8 years, I had been the architect of a success I was never allowed to own. I recalled site visits at 5 in the morning, the freezing Chicago wind biting through my coat while my father, Mark, was still asleep and Jordan was finding his zen in a Thai monastery. My parents had spent a decade treating my labor as an infinite resource. It was the trap of normalized cruelty, a psychological game where they borrowed my competence to patch up Jordan's fragile ego. They didn't see my 80-hour weeks as an achievement. They saw them as a family utility. To them, I wasn't a professional building an empire. I was just the reliable daughter whose purpose was to make the golden child look like a leader. I opened my personal laptop and looked at the files for the $8,640,000 legacy project. That contract didn't belong to Morgan and Company because of a brand name. It belonged to me because the developers trusted my signature on the structural reports. My father still relied on manual project boards and paper ledgers, refusing to see that the world had moved on. I had digitized their entire existence, turned handshakes into ironclad legal protections, and tripled our revenue in under 24 months. Every time I landed a multi-million-dollar deal, my mother, Michelle, would smooth her sunflower print apron and say, "That's nice, honey, but did you see Jordan's new branding idea?" They were blind to the fact that branding doesn't hold up a 50-story skyscraper, engineering does. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and now the account was empty. I thought about the legacy they were so desperate to protect. They wanted a dynasty built on bloodlines, but they had forgotten that a building is only as strong as its core. By removing myself, I wasn't just quitting a job. I was withdrawing the structural load I had been carrying alone. I looked at the city lights and realized that my worth was never a question for the world, it was only a question for the people who shared my last name. This was an audit of my boundaries, and I was finally correcting the math. The silence lasted exactly 3 days before the storm hit my phone. It started with a flood of missed calls from the office manager and panicked voicemails from project managers, asking one question: where are the files? Clint, our senior project manager, sounded like he was hyperventilating when he left a message about the Baxter Hill specs. Jordan had told the team the files were gone, and with a deadline at 4 o'clock, no one could find the documentation required to keep the site running. Then came my mother's manipulative phone calls. Her voice was thin and syrupy, claiming that I was just tired and that Jordan was learning. She talked about family unity while Jordan sent me a mocking text: "Stop the tantrum, Taylor. The firm is fine without your spreadsheets." Michelle didn't stop there. She took the conflict public, posting a quote on Facebook about how some people forget who raised them, subtly painting me as the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her parents during a growth phase. But the mockery ended when the Pride of Chicago building hit an emergency audit. Without my proprietary structural algorithms, the ones I had removed from the shared drive, Jordan couldn't prove the steel reinforcements met the new seismic codes. He sat in my old office, surrounded by blueprints he couldn't read and profit and loss statements that looked like a foreign language to him. Jordan was discovering the difference between having a title and being a leader. He had rented his authority using my intellectual property, and now that the lease had expired, he was exposed as a fraud. The firm began to bleed. The $2,760,000 contract with our biggest developer was pulled because the client refused to speak to anyone but me. My father sent a desperate message: "Wexler account is walking. They don't trust Jordan's leadership. Taylor, please, we need you." I didn't answer. I stared at the message and realized that need is not the same as value. They needed my labor to maintain the illusion of Jordan's success, but they still didn't value the person performing it. I poured another glass of wine and watched the city skyline, knowing that for the first time in 8 years, the only thing I was responsible for was myself. The professional collapse of Morgan and Company wasn't just a failure of management, it was an audit of the family's morality. I met with Jasmine, my attorney friend, in a quiet corner of a downtown cafe. I needed her to look through my old profit-sharing accounts and the firm's bylaws. While the city buzzed outside, Jasmine's expression shifted from professional focus to genuine horror. "Taylor, I found it," she said, sliding a laptop toward me. I stared at the ledgers. Mark and Michelle hadn't just demoted me, they had been actively stealing from me. Over the last year, they had secretly diverted $48,000 from my designated profit-sharing account money I had earned through 80-hour weeks and successful project completions. They hadn't used it for the business. They had used it to pay off the predatory debts from Jordan's failed tech startups in Thailand. It was the silence of the silent guardian that had allowed this to happen. For years, I had kept the firm profitable, creating a surplus that my parents felt entitled to harvest like a crop they hadn't planted. They were willing to bankrupt my future and steal my literal earnings to protect their golden boy from the consequences of his own incompetence. This was the kill shot. The betrayal had shifted from a toxic family dynamic to an actual criminal breach of fiduciary duty. My parents weren't just bad leaders. They were financial predators who viewed my success as a family asset they could liquidate whenever Jordan hit rock bottom. I looked at the documentation Jasmine had prepared. Truth isn't a weapon, but it is a master key. My compassion had been a resource they'd overdrafted for the last time. I realized then that my parents would never see me as an architect of their success. They only saw me as a battery that powered Jordan's delusions. I felt no sadness as I closed the folder. I felt the weight of 8 years of misplaced loyalty finally lifting. I was done being the invisible pillar holding up a house of thieves. The dinner at the Riverstone Club was a masterclass in desperation. Mark and Michelle sat at the corner table, looking aged and fragile, their carefully constructed world crumbling in the face of an impossible audit and a looming lawsuit. My father, once rigid and immovable, now had a voice that edged on total panic. They had spent the last week watching the firm bleed out, and they knew the only person who could stop the hemorrhage was the one they had written out of the story. "Taylor, please," Mark began, his hands resting on the table as if to keep it from spinning away from him. "We've been through the records. We know we made a mistake, a terrible mistake." He tried the family legacy angle, talking about the business he and Michelle had built from nothing. But I wasn't there to play daughter. I was there to perform a professional extraction. I didn't let him finish. I simply slid a white envelope across the table, a settlement that had been drafted with lethal precision. "This isn't a conversation about feelings, Dad," I said, my voice as cold as the steel beams I had spent my life designing. "It's a verification of my assets." The terms were non-negotiable. 35% ownership of the firm, permanent co-executive control, and Jordan's immediate removal from any and all operational authority. I watched my father's face go pale as he read the document. "This would give you equal power to protect what I built," he whispered. I leaned forward, my gaze clinical. "I didn't protect what you built. I protected what I built while you used my labor to prop up Jordan's failures. I forced them to see the world without the architect. I detailed the catastrophic future they were facing, the lawsuits, the criminal charges for the diverted $48,000, and the inevitable bankruptcy that would follow once the remaining clients walked. The once dominant Mark Henderson was left speechless. His authority evaporated because it had never been his own. It was a position he had rented using my intellectual property. I gave them 60 seconds to decide. The choice was simple: sign the papers and survive as equals, or keep their golden boy and lose everything. It took Mark exactly 43 seconds to pick up the pen. The papers were signed with a finality that echoed through the quiet restaurant. 35% equity, co-executive control, and a legally protected seat at the table that no one could ever take away again. I didn't return to the office as a daughter seeking a father's approval. I returned as a majority stakeholder who had proven her worth by having the courage to walk away. Monday morning, I walked back into the building wearing the same navy suit I'd worn to the Riverstone Club, a statement of cold, professional power. I called an all-hands meeting at 9 o'clock and looked at the team I had spent 8 years building. I told them simply that what happened in the past was over, but that we were here to rebuild what was lost and take the firm somewhere better. The room exhaled collectively. Jordan took a minor creative role, one safely removed from the profit and loss statements and the legal contracts he had proven he couldn't handle. He was free to find his vision without touching the structural load of the company. My father and I fell into an unexpected rhythm, no longer bound by the old roles of master and servant, but as aligned business partners. Within 2 months, we secured an $8,640,000 legacy project, the largest in the company's history. The client told me directly that they only signed because they wanted to work with the person who saved the firm from total collapse. It was the ultimate positive revenge, building a success so undeniable that the early dismissal of my talents became a historical footnote. That night, I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, watching the Chicago skyline glow below me. The silence no longer felt like a void. It felt like peace. I had learned that loyalty means nothing without respect, and that sometimes the best way to be seen is to simply stop being available to those who refuse to see you. My worth was no longer a conversation or a request. It was a documented, ironclad fact. If this story reminded you of your own worth, or if you've ever had to walk away to be seen, share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice and reclaiming your narrative.